Not all jokes are created equal, and some come with a price tag to prove it. In the American version of The Office, the pricey gag occurred during a Season 3 episode entitled The Benihana Christmas. Fans will no doubt remember the show's consistent quality when it comes to Christmas specials, and for a lot of people, the Benihana episode tends to rank among the best. This holiday romp opens with Carol Stills showing up at Michael Scott's office to dump him just before the holiday party. While there are many good reasons we can think of to break up with Season 3 Michael Scott, the last straw for Carol is a doctored Christmas card created by Mr. Scott in which he spliced his own head on top of an image of Carol's ex-husband from an old ski trip she took with her family.
What you didn't realize at the time was that I was with you, in a sense. I was in your heart
Michael,
and next to your kids. What?
This is so weird.
This setback sets up the drama of the episode. Michael is now stuck with 2 tickets to Sandals, Jamaica, and no one to enjoy the trip with. On top of that, he has to show his face at his office Christmas party without a date. Office suck-up Andy Bernard decides to take the heartbroken Michael on a boys' outing to Benihana to help him forget about Carol. With Dwight and Jim in tow, they head out to an awkward and boozy hibachi lunch that actually results in them picking up 2 young waitresses. Michael and Andy bring their new girlfriends back to the office Christmas party and hilarity ensues. Memorably, Michael has to make a mark on his girlfriend's arm with a Sharpie so he can remember which one is his. Although a nice hibachi dinner can certainly start to add up, especially if you order too many of those onion volcanoes, it wasn't the food that pushed the comedy bill into 5-figure territory on this one. While the use of Benihana's corporate trademarks came cheap, a different intellectual property issue required NBC to pay the piper. On a recent episode of the Office Ladies podcast, a delightful bit of weekly fan service hosted by Jenna Fisher, who played Pam, and Angela Kingsley, who played Angela, former staff writer Jen Salata stopped by to spill the beans on the expensive gag. According to Salata, the joke that ultimately had NBC reaching deep into its corporate pockets was a 4-second gag where Michael sings a couple of bars of 2 Tickets to Paradise by Any Money to relish his upcoming vacation to a Sandals resort in Jamaica.
I've got 2 tickets to paradise. Pack your bags, we're leaving day after tomorrow.
In her appearance on the Office Ladies podcast, Saletta said that the short joke came with a large price tag. She was informed of this fun fact after the fact by producer Kent Zbornak.
At the sound mix, I found out from Kent that was a $60,000 joke. None of my jokes I've ever written have been the $60,000 joke.
Saletta wasn't sure, but she told the podcast that she recalled the show's music budget being reduced not too long after the episode, leading her to believe that her little joke may have had a way bigger impact than she'd anticipated. The process of song clearance is a notorious pain in the entertainment business, and it can easily wreck a show or movie's production budget as costs get out of control.
What's your funding?
$200.
What's ours again?
$201.
Right.
In order to clear a song, lawyers representing the network, in this case NBC, have to work with the music label that holds the publishing rights for a song that's featured during an episode, no matter how small or incidental the feature. In this case, Eddie Money's publisher Columbia Records made $60,000 off of Michael's brief cover performance. Not too shabby for 4 seconds worth of someone else's work. As an interesting aside, A Benihana Christmas had another issue with song clearance. One scene from the episode features an Office performance of John Mayer's saccharine love song Your Body is a Wonderland. Office star BJ Novak, who plays Ryan the Temp, is actually friends with Mayer in real life and was able to negotiate a pretty reasonable settlement after overcoming some initial apprehension. The cost of Mayer's song? One personalized Dundie Award statue for Tallest Music Dude.
Filmmaking is a tricky business. It's a long journey from the script to the screen, and a lot of great and not so great scenes get left on the cutting room floor, costing the studio time and money. Here's a look at some of our favorite films whose deleted scenes came at a high price, creatively and financially. World War Z's darker final act. World War Z didn't just trim an expensive scene or 2. This movie's entire third act was gutted and replaced in post-production. In the theatrical ending, the movie concluded with Brad Pitt's Jerry Lane wandering around a research laboratory and discovering the scientific solution to all the world's zombie problems. But in the original shoot, things were supposed to be a lot grimmer for our hero. Before the revisions, Jerry and his sidekick Segan would have made it to Russia to do a blockbuster-sized battle with zombies, and discover a method of undead defeat the old-fashioned way. But there was still trouble on the home front, as his wife and children were in North America, and she'd turned to prostitution to provide for her family, and ultimately shacked up with her former colleague, played by Matthew Fox. This would have culminated in Pitt's character questing across Siberia to make way to his now estranged wife, leaving room for what would have been a full-on trilogy of World War Z films. But the studio wanted a happier ending for the film and brought in a bunch of new creatives to rewrite and reshoot the third act, and everything else, including almost all of Fox's parts, were left on the cutting room floor, never to see the light of day. Not only did Paramount lose the money they'd already spent for the clipped scenes, but the reshoots ended up costing a whopping $25 million as well. And that, friends, is what you call a pricey pivot. Rogue scenes in X-Men Days of Future Past. With its crazy time travel plot, X-Men Days of Future Past is packed with familiar faces. But unfortunately, that means limited screen time for some of our favorite characters, including Anna Paquin's Rogue. The True Blood actress spent a week filming several elaborate scenes for the 2014 blockbuster, alongside fellow X-Men vets, but none of it wound up in the finished film. Director Bryan Singer told Entertainment Weekly, "Through the editing process, the sequence became extraneous. Like many things in the editing process, it was an embarrassment of riches, and it was just one of the things that had to go." After fan outcry, Singer and 20th Century Fox released a rogue cut of the film on DVD, restoring 17 minutes of previously cut footage that included Paquin sequences. The original tragic ending of Little Shop of Horrors. If all had gone as director Frank Oz and screenwriter Howard Ashman had initially planned, this 1986 adaptation of the Broadway musical wouldn't have ended quite as happily. The pair intended to use the ending from the stage version of Little Shop of Horrors, with Audrey 2 eating Audrey and Seymour and terrorizing the world, but test audiences hated it.
Does it have to be human? Does it have to be mine?
Oz recalls to Entertainment Weekly, "For every musical number there was applause. They loved it. It was fantastic. Until we killed our two leads. And then the theater became a refrigerator, an icebox. In order to get the movie released, they needed better audience approval, so the elaborate 23-minute sequence, which cost a reported $5 million, was scrapped, and the new ending was shot with the two leads alive and well. Though a black and white version of the original ending was included on a 1998 DVD release, full color footage was finally included in a director's cut edition Blu-ray in 2012. The Jitterbug dance number from The Wizard of Oz. The Wicked Witch uses a lot of different tactics to try to stop Dorothy and her friends in The Wizard of Oz, but one never made it into the final version of the film. In the lost Jitterbug sequence, Dorothy, the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Cowardly Lion travel through the haunted woods only to be attacked by evil bugs that cause them to break out in song and dance. Also a popular dance style at the time, the Jitterbug was actually a remnant of an older version of the script that was tossed out. The whole number cost about $80,000 and took 5 weeks to shoot, but it was cut when producers decided the film was too long. Though the actual footage was destroyed, composer Harold Arlen captured a dress rehearsal of the number on video, later included as an extra on the DVD version of the film. Maybe the original footage will turn up in a studio storage space like Dorothy's old ruby slippers did. Returning to Krypton in Superman Returns. Before DC and Warner Brothers decided to reboot the Superman franchise yet again in 2013 with Zack Snyder at the helm, Bryan Singer's 2006 entry starring Brandon Routh as a Man of Steel flew into theaters with fairly mixed reviews. Superman Returns also nearly arrived with a completely different opening sequence. While the basic plot of the film deals with Superman's return to Earth after a 5-year absence, Singer shot a wordless, visually stunning 5-minute opening sequence with Routh's Superman visiting what was left of his home planet, Krypton. The scene, which cost an estimated $10 million, is slow and contemplative rather than bombastic and exciting. Maybe that's why producers ultimately had Singer cut it. The scene was finally released as an extra on the 2011 Superman Anthology Blu-ray set, further dividing critics and fans on the one-off superhero flick. Eric Stoltz's scenes from Back to the Future. As most Back to the Future fans know, Eric Stoltz was originally cast as Marty McFly, the puffy vest-wearing teenager sent back to 1955 in a souped-up DeLorean. Director Robert Zemeckis initially wanted to hire Michael J. Fox, but his Family Ties shooting schedule was too demanding at the time, and he hired Stoltz instead. 5 weeks into filming, Zemeckis and producer Steven Spielberg knew they needed to replace Stoltz because he just wasn't funny enough. Zemeckis and Spielberg quickly negotiated with Universal to replace Stoltz with Fox, adding a reported $3 million to the film's budget and extra time onto its shooting schedule. Soon, Fox was on set at the Twin Pines Mall shooting with Christopher Lloyd, and the rest, of course, is history.
Great Scott! I know, this is heavy.
Over 400 TV shows are broadcast every year, and that means the competition for viewers is fierce. As a result, networks are often willing to spend big money on projects they think will lure in the biggest audience. They place their bets and sometimes lose their shirts. Here are some of the most expensive TV flops to ever have their plugs pulled. Battlestar Galactica. Most people today know Battlestar Galactica as the marathon-worthy sci-fi series that ran from 2003 to 2009. Hardcore fans, however, might remember that the series originated in 1978 and tanked in the ratings a year later. Setting out to be a TV take on Star Wars, the original Galactica cost roughly $1 million per episode, more than double that of a typical primetime show at the time, and the equivalent of over $3.7 million today. At first, it was worth the price tag. The series' early episodes attracted positive reviews and healthy ratings, but those ratings eventually began to slip, and behind-the-scenes issues like censorship made production difficult. Ultimately, Battlestar Galactica couldn't pull its weight as compared to other less expensive network hits, such as ABC's own Mork and Mindy, and the show was canceled after a single season. The network did give it another go with Galactica 1980, but that show only lasted 10 episodes before being decommissioned due to non-existent viewers. Supertrain. When it comes to expensive flops, you'd be hard-pressed to find a bigger train wreck than 1979's Supertrain. As you might expect from the title, the NBC show was basically just Love Boat meets Snowpiercer, set on a massive nuclear-powered locomotive featuring its own nightclubs and casinos that could speed from New York to Los Angeles at 200 miles per hour. The thing is, the train didn't actually exist, so the show's creators used expensive model trains while filming. Unfortunately, the models weren't particularly durable, and one of them was destroyed in a crash before the first episode was even filmed. After the show debuted to downright terrible ratings, famous celebrities were brought on to keep Supertrain on track. Tony Danza, Rue McClanahan, and Dick Van Dyke all made guest appearances. But even that late 70s star power couldn't stop Supertrain from going off the rails. The show was canceled after 9 episodes and remains one of NBC's costliest flops to date at a reported $4 million an episode. Father of the Pride. It makes a lot of sense that after Shrek raked it in at the box office, NBC was willing to fork over big bucks to DreamWorks for a computer-animated show of their own. It makes a lot less sense that they decided that the project that would be worth $2.5 million of their money would be a show that recast the White Lions from Siegfried and Roy's famous Las Vegas Magic Act as a wacky sitcom family. The result was Father of the Pride. Unlike Shrek, which somehow spawned an unstoppable franchise that we just can't seem to get rid of, it failed to capture the hearts and minds of those who watched it. It did, however, capture plenty of unwanted attention. The Parents Television Council flooded the FCC with allegations that Father of the Pride was indecent. To make matters worse, the show came in hot on the heels of Roy being nearly mauled to death when one of his tigers dragged him off stage by the neck, the first such accident in more than 5,000 shows. With all that stacked against it, it didn't take long for NBC to make the show disappear after only 13 episodes. Viva Laughlin. When some shows get canceled, they leave viewers feeling like they missed out on something good that never got a chance to shine. When CBS dropped the hammer on 2007's Viva Laughlin, however, it was a mercy killing that freed the audience from what the New York Times suggested might be the worst show in the history of television. Made in an effort to diverge from the standard lineup of police procedurals and grandparent-focused sitcoms, CBS banked big on a remake of Viva Blackpool, a popular BBC show with a bizarre premise, a murder mystery that would occasionally break out into elaborate musical numbers where the cast sang pop songs.
I'm still standing better than I ever did, looking like a true survivor.
Despite the presence of producer and star Hugh Jackman, critics and viewers alike hated the casino-themed musical from the opening number. Its ratings were dismal, and it quickly became a go-to punchline on the E! Network's The Soup as a show beloved by hundreds, which might have been overstating. After only 2 episodes, Viva Laughlin danced its way off airwaves. And with the pilot purportedly costing $6.8 million, cutting losses early is probably the right call. Camelot. As the first series ordered under Chris Albrecht, the newly crowned president and CEO of Starz, hopes were riding high on 2011's Arthurian drama, Camelot. According to Albrecht, the show was based on, quote, an idea of hope that has resonated at different times throughout history. Unfortunately, 2011 was not one of those times. Critical reviews of Camelot were less than stellar. But while the show still saw solid ratings during its final episodes, Starz canceled the fantasy drama after only one season. Scheduling conflicts with lead cast members Joseph Fiennes, Jamie Campbell-Bower, and Ava Green made a sophomore effort more trouble than it was worth. And it was worth quite a lot. According to the Wall Street Journal, the series cost roughly $7 million per episode. That's a lot of money, huh? Look, you can't blame us for trying that one. Kings. Betting on the star power of Deadwood's Ian McShane, the writing prowess of American Gods' Michael Green, and some assistance from the Hunger Games Catching Fire director Francis Lawrence, NBC seemed poised to hit it big with 2009's Kings, an ambitious drama reimagining the life of the biblical King David in a modern setting. The 2-hour premiere cost a massive $10 million, with each subsequent episode coming in at $4 million a pop. With that kind of money behind a television series, you better believe the stakes were high. In this case, producers rolled snake eyes and cashed out with dismal ratings. But Kings wasn't just costly for NBC. Liberty Mutual invested a $5 million sponsorship into the show, reportedly aiming to subconsciously piggyback on the show's message of personal responsibility to encourage viewers to buy insurance. With barely anyone watching the show, however, it's safe to assume Liberty Mutual didn't exactly get what it paid for. Kings was first banished to the dog days of summer before NBC officially called it quits. Still, the show isn't as bad as its ratings imply, and it might be worth going back if you missed it the first time around. Marco Polo. Netflix is no stranger to dropping big money on big projects. But in the case of 2014's Marco Polo, the series never really found its way to an audience and wound up losing big in the process. At the time of Marco Polo's release, no active series was more expensive to produce, except HBO's fantasy juggernaut Game of Thrones. The first season of Netflix's Kublai Khan-centered drama cost a staggering $90 million, which weighs in at $9 million per episode. Unfortunately for Netflix, Marco Polo never came close to Game of Thrones' success. Despite lackluster critical reviews, Netflix gave Marco Polo a second season. The sophomore effort was less popular than the first, prompting the streaming service to give the series the axe. In this case, a 13th century Mongol axe.
Movies take a staggering amount of money to make, and nowadays, any budget below $50 million is considered mid to low range. That level of spending usually works out in the end, since movies also make a staggering amount of money, but not all producers are lucky enough to earn back their investment. In the case of these films, the films did so poorly at the box office that they're considered cautionary tales in Tinseltown. The 13th Warrior. Adapted from a Michael Crichton novel, The 13th Warrior is loosely based upon the myth of Beowulf. While the film earned some recognition for its expensive set pieces, those costly moments ended up ballooning the film's budget to $160 million, while the box office returns were only $61.7 million, leaving the film with a deficit of almost $100 million. The movie's failure to find an audience is a bit of a puzzler, since the source material was by a proven best-selling writer and it was directed by Die Hard's John McTiernan. But no matter the reason, the end results were so embarrassing that the co-star, Omar Sharif, ended up briefly retiring from acting in disgust. The Adventures of Pluto Nash. Eddie Murphy used to be a reliable hitmaker, with successes in everything from action-adventure films to zany comedies to movies that required him to suit up for almost every character. He even had some successes on the family film scene, with Dr. Dolittle and Shrek confirming that kiddos like to laugh at him just as much as adults. But his star power burnt out somewhere between those films and The Adventures of Pluto Nash, because the film earned back just $7.1 million of its $100 million budget. It's not hard to see why the film fared so poorly. With mediocre special effects, a confusing and unfunny script, and a nonsensical future setting, even Eddie Murphy's big name couldn't save the film from flopping hard. Stealth. Rob Cohen was behind the lens for a number of hits, including The Fast and the Furious and Triple X. But his box office streak took a serious nosedive when his aviation actioner Stealth crashed and burned at the box office. The film followed a crew of Air Force pilots trying to control an artificial intelligence jet. But instead of being a compelling adventure movie, it was more like a science fiction parody of Top Gun. It grossed just $76 million against a $135 million budget and made good on its title by sneaking away from the theaters largely unnoticed. Sahara. Based on a massively successful series of books about a rugged adventurer with a quick wit and a way with women, Sahara looked like it might be able to recapture the magic of Indiana Jones. Unfortunately for everyone involved, the built-in audience for the books didn't translate to a box office success, and Sahara grossed a modest $119.3 million. That wasn't enough to cover its $160 million budget and $81 million in distribution costs. Part of it could have just been poor timing, since the movie starred Matthew McConaughey before his star power returned in full force with The McConaissance.
It'd be a lot cooler if you did.
But either way, the studio was parched after this movie's returns. Mars Needs Moms. Disney's experiment with motion capture performance, co-produced by legendary director Robert Zemeckis, seemed like a good idea on paper. And Mars Needs Moms wasn't conceptually off the mark either, as it followed a 9-year-old trying to save his mom from aliens who wanted to harness her powers to juice up their nanny bots, which is the stuff of fairly standard family fare. But while the film's effects were cutting edge, they gave an almost uncomfortable eeriness to every character's facial expressions. And rather than an exciting adventure or a surreal nightmare of a film, the movie ended up being a snooze. Audiences on Earth didn't have much interest in it, handing over just $39 million in ticket fare against a whopping $150 million budget. The Mouse House might not usually have trouble wrangling in the kiddos to see their animated features, but this movie marked a major write-down for the studio. Speaking of Disney flops in outer space, John Carter. Based on the seminal works of Edgar Rice Burroughs, which influenced everything from Star Wars to parts of the DC universe, John Carter seemed like a sure thing on paper. In practice, though, the film felt ironically derivative and trite. John Carter managed to make $73 million domestically, with worldwide sales barely pushing the film past its $250 million budget. Considering it took around $100 million more to market the movie, Disney took a hefty loss on the would-be tentpole project. The title hero of the film might be less affected by gravity on Mars, but here on Earth, he was brought down hard. R.I.P.D. The title of this film is an acronym for the Rest in Peace Department, a special police force that takes care of renegade spirits before they can affect the human world. It's basically Men in Black with a supernatural twist, and the casting of Ryan Reynolds as the upstart partner to Jeff Bridges' grumpy mentor seemed like a no-brainer. Unfortunately, the movie was pronounced DOA, barely making back $78 million of its $130 million budget. While the failure of certain films can sometimes be attributed to poor marketing, studio interference, or even rival movie releases that are oddly similar, the blame for R.I.P.D. rests pretty entirely on the film itself. It's relentlessly unfunny. Bridges and Reynolds seem like they're so bored with the script that they might as well be on the other side. But hey, maybe they were just method acting the whole time.
Tough day.
The Lone Ranger. The character the Lone Ranger is a classic part of American pop culture. Unfortunately for the makers of the 2013 reboot of the hit TV and radio series, however, the film was plagued with problems from start to finish. For starters, the film drew ire over casting Johnny Depp as the Native American sidekick Tonto, which prompted massive criticism over its decision to whitewash the character. Then there was the matter of its bloated budget, which was $215 million before marketing costs. And to top it all off, critics laughed at the film for all the wrong reasons.
Justice is what I seek, Kimosabe.
Maybe just pick a different hat next time?
Whether emptying the streets of Times Square, wrecking state-of-the-art sports cars for fun, or blowing up real military ships, the movies on this list have invested heavily in solitary scenes. Lasting mere minutes, these sequences are the most expensive movie scenes ever filmed. Vanilla Sky sets the tone of surreal, reality-questioning confusion from the opening scene. The perfectly groomed, gray-hair-plucking Playboy millionaire David Ames wakes as Radiohead's Everything in Its Right Place aptly lyricizes his life. Immaculate, flawless, perfected. Yet as David drives his vintage Ferrari through the streets of New York, the first cracks in this illusion appear. He drives to Times Square, the crossroads of the world, with approximately 330,000 daily passers-by. It's completely empty. Not even the faintest hint of the usual hustle and bustle. David wakes abruptly. It was all a dream, a false awakening interpreted by his therapist as a metaphor.
Well, I suppose the empty street meant loneliness.
You're a shrink. You gotta do better than that.
At only 30 seconds of screen time, the scene provides a fundamental function in the narrative, questioning the nature of reality and our relationship to dreams. Surprisingly, no CGI was used. Instead, director Cameron Crowe struck a deal with the NYPD to close off the area between 5 a.m. and 8 a.m. on a Sunday in November 2000. The result was a spectacular sequence with a spectacular price tag, over $1 million for 30 seconds of footage. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Combining Cruise's enigmatic star power with the desolate backdrop helps create a poignant scene lacking in the 1997 Spanish-language original Open Your Eyes. In I Am Legend, Will Smith roams the post-apocalyptic streets of New York City as Dr. Robert Neville, a virologist attempting to find a cure for the zombie-producing Crippen virus. To create the feeling of desperate isolation, the film, like Vanilla Sky, has empty streets to match Warner Brothers' empty wallets. However, a substantial chunk of its $150 million budget was allocated to a much more populated scene, capturing Neville's tragic separation from his wife and child. In flashbacks, the audience sees that New York City was evacuated and placed under quarantine during the outbreak. In a race against time, Neville's family boards a helicopter to escape. Then comes a breathtaking moment of tragedy. The military bombs the Brooklyn Bridge. Amidst the chaos, the blazing bridge collapses into the water below, and Neville's family tragically dies in the ensuing accident. A fair share of digital magic was used to capture the missile's impact. Still, the surrounding evacuation was shot on location across 6 nights, requiring the cooperation of 1,000 extras, 14 different government agencies, an expansive lighting rig, and a crew of 250. Increased bureaucracy post 9/11 made acquiring the green light on the project a task that cost a cool $5 million. Think of James Bond, and what's the first thing that comes to mind? Aside from a cat-stroking evil genius, cool gadgets, and Bond girls, the answer is probably luxurious cars. After all, what would 007 be without an Aston Martin DB5 for company, a car featured in 7 different installments? Snazzy automobiles are largely part of the series' mythology, and Spectre continued that tradition by placing Daniel Craig in the front seat of the stylish Aston Martin DB10, a car produced exclusively for the 2015 film. Illustrative of the multi-millions Hollywood has to play with, $32 million of Spectre's rumored $300 million to $350 million budget was spent destroying cars.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
The biggest expenditure came from totaling 7 of the 10 aforementioned DB10s, a fact that will no doubt cause car enthusiasts to shed a tear. Chief Stunt Coordinator Gary Powell told the Daily Mail, "In Rome, we wrecked millions of pounds worth." The DB10 sped through the narrow streets of the Vatican at top speeds of 110 miles per hour in a cat-and-mouse chase with a henchman in a Jaguar CX-75. A set amount for this singular scene hasn't been confirmed, but the number of destroyed DB10s were, quote, shot one entire night for 4 seconds of film, making its cost per footage ratio astronomically high. Smashing DB10s to smithereens is frugal when compared to Bryan Singer's Superman Returns. Resurrecting Kal-El on-screen nearly 2 decades after Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, one particular scene depicted Superman returning to Krypton. Abstract, atmospheric, and visually striking, the CGI-heavy sequence is intriguing, channeling elements of thoughtful, slow-paced sci-fi. However, that tone was such a stark contrast to the rest of the film, a fun superhero movie, that Warner Brothers chose to cut it out of the final cut. It was a bold decision, not least from a financial perspective. Creating Superman's homeworld cost an estimated $10 million, making it one of the most expensive scenes in history, and most likely the costliest deleted scene ever. Superman Returns earned favorable reviews, although it failed to capture the imagination of audiences, illustrated by an underwhelming worldwide box office of $391 million. Maybe that Krypton scene would have helped. 4 years after Neo swallowed the red pill and unveiled the true nature of reality in The Matrix, the philosophical cyberpunk sensation returned in 2003 with the second installment in the trilogy. This time, the Wachowskis had over double the budget, which, it's safe to say, they spent wisely. Ignoring the adage "don't play with traffic," the duo rejected digital effects and instead constructed a fake freeway at a decommissioned naval base in Alameda, California.
You always told me to stay off the freeway.
Yes, that's true.
Stretching a mile and a half, the set was the backdrop for Reloaded's white-knuckle chase between Morpheus, Trinity, the twins, and a host of agents. Surprisingly, the Wachowskis also opted for real-life stunts. Trinity actress Carrie Ann Moss, who overcame a, quote, major fear of motorcycles shooting the scene, told IGN they needed to have the best stunt people in the world. It was dangerous. You could really feel that every day you went out there. The final result is 20 minutes of mind-blowing, physics-defying carnage, and one of the most memorable car chases in cinematic history. As for the total cost, that had the blue pill treatment, never to be revealed publicly. However, the freeway alone cost $2.5 million. Throw in over 100 destroyed cars, practical effects, and CGI, and a significant percentage of the $150 million budget was likely spent on this single sequence. The Second World War was one of the deadliest conflicts in history, with casualties estimated to be over 56 million. One of the most bone-chilling, unfathomably brutal battles, the D-Day landing, was also the largest seaborne invasion in history. Those who weren't there will never truly know what it was like, but Steven Spielberg's acclaimed portrayal in 1998's Saving Private Ryan offers some insight. Most notable is its depiction of the Allies' arrival on Omaha Beach, a tense sequence Empire magazine ranked as the, quote, greatest battle in cinema. An unforgettable opening 25 minutes depict Tom Hanks' Captain Miller facing impossible odds, marching through blood-soaked sand, outmaneuvering explosions and dodging bullets, leading the way for the Allies' eventual victory at the German-occupied shore. It's filmmaking at its finest. Realistic, immersive, heartbreaking. And it earned Spielberg the Oscar for Best Director. Shot over the course of 4 weeks, a cast of 750 captured the horror of that fateful day on June 6, 1944. Unable to shoot at Omaha Beach, Spielberg shot on location on the east coast of Ireland at Curracloe Strand. With minimal direction in the original script, most shots were, quote, spur of the moment and unplanned ahead of time. Spielberg told DGA Quarterly of the approach, "It helped make things a little more chaotic and unpredictable. Considering the magnitude of the scene and its lasting cultural impact, its $12 million budget might have been a good deal." Michael Bay is renowned for larger-than-life spectacles brimming with huge explosions and bomb-tastic set pieces, epitomized by his live-action Transformers franchise. Clearly, there's a thirst for big robots that turn into things, with the series earning a total worldwide box office of $4.48 billion.
Autobots, roll out!
The Last Night was the most poorly reviewed in the series, receiving a measly 15% on Rotten Tomatoes, but that wasn't due to a lack of investment. Its budget was a whopping $217 million, with a large chunk of that spent on location for one particular scene. As previous Transformers installment Age of Extinction concluded in a junkyard, producers were keen to maintain continuity. Phoenix Film Commissioner Phil Bradstock wryly remarked to Phoenix Business Journal, "The movie's art director was probably just doing a Google image search for a junkyard, and they came across this junkyard just north of Deer Valley Airport." Arizona's authorities won't be complaining about the fortuitous Google image search, though. It led to a hefty investment in the area. In a rare, detailed insight, Bradstock revealed that over the 10-day shoot, producers hired 40 locals to work behind the scenes, as well as 50 local vendors and 3,000 cumulative hotel nights. 2 months on location equated to an investment of $15 million, before factoring in CGI and other cost-increasing factors. Marlon Brando was widely regarded as one of the finest actors of his generation, if not any generation, when he won his second Academy Award for his captivating portrayal of Don Corleone in 1972's The Godfather. That film was also a blockbuster, and if the producers of the first big-budget Superman movie wanted to secure the great Brando to play Superman's father, Jor-El, they were certainly going to have to dig deep and pay up.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
Brando ultimately appears in 1978's Superman the Movie for about 10 minutes out of the film's 143-minute running time. And yet he received top billing, over both Academy Award winner Gene Hackman, who played Lex Luthor, and relative newcomer Christopher Reeve, who actually portrayed the lead character. In addition to an appearance fee of $3.7 million, Brando was also contractually obligated to take home 12% of the film's profits. The former Godfather's take was $19 million. In 2020 dollars, that's about $75 million. And this doesn't even count the expensive-looking Krypton sets that filmmakers had to build for Brando's brief scenes. It's almost impossible to imagine the magnitude of the production behind Ben-Hur. The 1959 adaptation of Lew Wallace's novel and remake of the 1925 silent film of the same name is memorable for its extravagance. A stunning 9-minute chariot race is the crux of Wallace's story, and William Wyler's feature gravitates around the same centerpiece. Enduring acclaim is a deserving accomplishment. Following 5 years of preparation, the production was tireless and demanding, including 300 sets covering 140 acres, 9 sound stages, and thousands of extras. Set at Cinecittà Studios in Italy, it was the largest film set of its era. The arena alone, set in the fictional ancient city Antioch, was built by a construction team of 750 workers, created to capture the race between Judah Ben-Hur and Messala. Shot over 10 weeks, the singular scene cost $4 million. In today's money, that's over $34 million, or around $3.7 million for each minute of footage. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer wanted the experience to lure audiences into theaters, though, and it worked. To this day, Ben-Hur is one of the highest-grossing films ever, proving sometimes that hefty investments pay off. In 2001, director Michael Bay, at the time best known for Armageddon, took his penchant for big explosions and dazzling effects shots and applied them to a story set against the backdrop of actual historical events. The result? Pearl Harbor, an epic action movie that takes place primarily during events leading up to the 1941 Japanese military bombing of the US base in Hawaii. Bay went all out to realistically and graphically depict the bombing of Pearl Harbor, one of the most famous and destructive acts in American history. And this is no computer-generated mayhem and bloodshed. Bay used practical effects, and a lot of them. The crew employed the use of 700 sticks of dynamite and 4,000 gallons of gasoline to properly blow up 6 inactive ships from the Navy. It took around a month to set everything up, and the director certainly didn't want to miss anything, so he set up 12 cameras to film it all. In all, this one scene in Pearl Harbor cost approximately $5.5 million.
In 2018, the North American box office has had its share of high-profile bombs. There was Solo, the worst-performing Star Wars movie in the history of Star Wars, and Skyscraper, the millionth movie Dwayne Johnson's made this year. But nothing even comes close to the disastrous performance of the Chinese film Azura. Made with a reported budget of $113 million, Azura debuted to just $7.1 million, and before the weekend was over, it had been pulled from theaters. So why did China's most expensive movie ever made bomb so hard at the box office? What is Azura? An adaptation of ancient Tibetan legends and Buddhist mythology, Azura follows a young man who's discovered he's destined to save a heavenly dimension, which is under attack by a 3-headed king named Azura. Over the course of his journey, he discovers he's the reincarnation of one of Azura's heads, which had lost 100 years ago during a previous invasion attempt. Azura is about a hero's journey, one that was pitched as the start of a trilogy, but it doesn't look like any sequels are coming anytime soon. Sabotage. Azura's producers are accusing China's most prominent film review aggregating websites of letting users tank the movie ratings with illegitimate reviews. There are 3 sites in China that work as the equivalent of Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. Azura's early average score on one was an 8.4 out of 10, while the other 2 registered at 4.9 and a 3.1. What explains that discrepancy? The people behind Azura are convinced that their movie is the victim of a focused, malicious attack. Specifically, the producers claim that they discovered a large number of 1 out of 10 scores from suspicious-looking users which were posted immediately after the film hit theaters. In an official statement, they have announced, "Whoever is behind this is dirty, stupid, and ridiculous." Yanked from theaters. Rather than cut their losses and ride out the storm, Azura's filmmakers decided to snatch their movie back out of theaters as quickly as possible. Only a few other movies have gotten the hook in China. In 2012, Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained was unexpectedly pulled from Chinese theaters literally minutes after being released. But that was only done for the sake of censorship, and Django returned to theaters in a matter of weeks after edits were made. Azura's situation is entirely different. It was pulled by the film's own producers, for the drastic purposes of editing it to somehow make it better. But to appreciably raise the movie's quality through editing would likely take months, as opposed to weeks. World-class effects. One of Azura's biggest attempted innovations is its larger-than-usual focus on special effects. This might seem unusual to American moviegoers who are used to seeing state-of-the-art special effects as a matter of course. But in the past, Chinese-produced movies typically haven't had as much money pumped into them. As a result, their special effects often looked embarrassingly cheap. Azura aimed to break that mold. It seems no expense was spared to bring the movie's effects to the standard set by American movies. That included hiring in-demand, award-winning Hollywood talent, including veterans of Deadpool, Lord of the Rings, and Furious 7. But while the money seems to have all ended up on screen, it doesn't appear to have been a good investment. Middling marketing. Another one of Azura's problems is the sort of thing that could strike any movie anywhere, a lack of effective marketing. Despite 6 years worth of development and build-up, when it came time to actually sell Azura to potential audiences, it looks like the ball got dropped at a critical moment. At least that's one claim that's been circulating, stemming from Chinese market analysts. According to a representative of Beijing-based showbiz market research firm Fan King, based on our tracking, pre-release market heat for this movie was quite low, below average. Regardless of whether or not that's an accurate assessment of the situation, Azura now has a reputation as a movie almost nobody wanted to see. Untested director. What else could have gone wrong here? For one thing, director Peng Zhang is an untested quantity. Though he's been a stunt coordinator for many Hollywood productions, including Wonder Woman, The Last Samurai, and Rush Hour 3, Azura is his first ever project as director. Think about that for a second. What's purported to be the most expensive film ever made in the history of China was directed by a person who had never directed a movie before in his life. We're not saying Azura's failure is Zhang's fault. We're just pointing out that a first-time director seems like an incredibly strange choice to head up such an expensive, high-stakes production.
It's no secret that Netflix is a big spender. In 2017 alone, the streaming service dropped $6.3 billion on original and acquired programming, demolishing the video content budgets of Viacom, Amazon, CBS, Apple, and Facebook. But the lion's share of Netflix's budget, of course, goes to original programming. And to do that, the company has signed off on some seriously extravagant series. But which are the most expensive shows Netflix has ever produced? We've got your numbers. Hemlock Grove. American creature killer series Hemlock Grove was supposed to be a surefire hit for Netflix, but it ended up being little more than an average show with a hefty price tag.
Is there something you want to tell me?
I'm about to do things I don't want to. Sooner or later, I'm gonna have to give in.
When it premiered in 2013, Hemlock Grove ranked among Netflix's most expensive shows to date, reportedly costing $40 million for season 1's 13 episodes, far more than most major television networks are willing to shell out for even a 22-episode run.
Entire bloodlines are about to become extinct.
The series received a less than stellar critical reception, though it did manage to garner a dedicated fan base which ultimately kept the show alive for 2 additional seasons before Netflix pulled the plug. Orange is the New Black. As one of Netflix's most well-known and widely acclaimed series, it's not surprising that Orange is the New Black ranks among the most expensive offerings on the platform.
These are complicated ladies in a complicated place.
According to Peter Michelli, former co-head of TV at CAA, the show runs just under $4 million per episode. But investing in the screen rights to Piper Kerman's memoir of the same name has paid massive dividends for Netflix in awards and worldwide brand recognition.
I'm gonna be super famous. Don't forget to sneeze.
House of Cards. At the time of its creation, political thriller House of Cards set a new standard for Netflix, for quality as well as production costs. Former star and executive producer Kevin Spacey once said the production reportedly spent $100 million on the first season alone.
We don't submit to terror. We make the terror.
As the show closes in on its 6th and final season, Sans Spacey, in late 2018, the series will go down as a hit for the platform. Netflix reportedly upped their subscriber count by at least 27.5 million when House of Cards debuted in 2013, with the ultra-popular political drama playing a major role in the streaming service winning their fans' vote.
We're just getting started.
Seinfeld's comedy. Netflix isn't just shelling out for high-profile original series, it's also forking it over for original stand-up as well. And no deal was more expensive than the one they made with Jerry Seinfeld.
Would I have been funnier if I grew up in Peoria in a whorehouse raised by prostitutes? Absolutely. But this is what I had to work with.
Netflix reportedly paid Seinfeld a staggering $100 million for a pair of stand-up specials, bundled with the streaming rights to his hit web series Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. But the platform was happy to pay Seinfeld's lofty premium. Netflix's chief content officer, Ted Sarandos, told Deadline, "Jerry is known the world over as both a great TV innovator and beloved comic voice. We are incredibly proud to welcome him to the Netflix comedy family."
You excited?
I wouldn't say I'm excited, but I'm looking forward to it.
The Get Down.
Baz Luhrmann and Stephen Adly Guirgis' South Bronx musical drama, The Get Down, caused a lot of tension between Sony Pictures Television and Netflix.
According to Variety,
The show's 2.5-year production saw 2 showrunners and a whole slew of writers come and go, allegedly due to Lerman's involvement. A money-burning budget coupled with a lack of actual filming saw Sony get fed up quickly. But Netflix's Sarandos refused to greenlight development until Lerman agreed to direct the series from start to finish.
The borough where I'm from ain't the slums. We got kings, and that's what I'll be. My friends and me.
When The Get Down's 12-episode season finally wrapped, production reportedly ended up costing at least $120 million and possibly more than $190 million all in, making it one of the most expensive shows in television history. But while it was canceled after its first season, Netflix's VP of Original Content, Cindy Holland, told Variety, "We're about supporting our artists and supporting their vision. Working with Baz and his team was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life." The Crown. Netflix's historical drama The Crown tells the biographical story of Queen Elizabeth II and boasts production costs that would make the real royal family tighten their corsets.
What do you want, a degree? No one wants a college lecturer as sovereign. They want a queen.
The show's first season alone reportedly cost a record-setting $130 million in 2016. Although show creator Peter Morgan thinks that estimation is closer to the total cost for the first 2 seasons, that still equates to a whopping $6.5 to $13 million per hour-long episode. Helping drive up production costs was the flawless recreation of Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress, which cost approximately $37,000.
We had teams of 6 people working for 6 weeks just embroidering the train and the dress.
That, and someone had to sign off on a life-size replica of Buckingham Palace. Altered Carbon. Debuting in February 2018, dystopian cyberpunk series Altered Carbon is rumored to be one of Netflix's most expensive shows.
You've been provided with this body, which came equipped with military-grade neurochem and combat muscle memory.
Based on the 2002 novel by Richard K. Morgan, Altered Carbon remained in development for nearly a decade and a half. Originally optioned by Warner Brothers, the show began its expensive march to Netflix's lineup once Terminator Genesis screenwriter Lita Kalogridis and Game of Thrones director Miguel Sapochnik signed on. The exact cost of Altered Carbon's production remains a conservatively estimated $7 million per episode. However, Kalogridis told THR, "That number is really funny. I feel comfortable saying that number is not correct. I would say it's inaccurate. Regardless of how off the first season's $70 million estimate may be, if this show gets its second season, it'll likely be breaking the bank as one of Netflix's most expensive shows ever."
I thought you'd be bigger. They made me bring all this back up.
Everyone expects some props to be destroyed during a film shoot. Every once in a while, though, something breaks that no one expected or budgeted for. These are the costliest things destroyed while making movies, historic toilets and all. When Jennifer Jason Leigh watched in horror as Kurt Russell smashes a replica of an authentic 1870s Martin guitar in The Hateful Eight, her reaction was entirely real, because Russell unknowingly destroyed the actual Martin and not the replica. Someone forgot to swap the real guitar for the prop. Leigh told Billboard, "Kurt felt terrible. He had no idea. When he found out, his eyes literally welled up." Leigh was heartbroken. She'd just learned to play guitar on that Martin, and she'd even been allowed to take it home to practice. Before she learned it was a museum piece, Leigh had even inquired about the price. She was interested in taking it home once production was done. Martin Guitar Museum director Dick Boak told Reverb that the museum, quote, "will no longer loan guitars to movies under any circumstances." Skyfall, the third James Bond movie to be filmed in Istanbul, might be the last filmed there after a stuntman crashed a motorcycle into a 330-year-old jewelry shop. The opening chase sees Bond pursuing the villainous Patrice across the rooftops of Istanbul. It culminates in a dramatic crash through a breakable prop window into the tight, vibrant corridors of the Grand Bazaar. What you don't see is the immediate aftermath. Swerving to avoid packed throngs of extras, the stuntman lost control of his bike and smashed right through the real crystal glass window of a historic jewelry shop. It's incredible how much preparation went into this scene and how things went awry anyway. Production manager Menderes Demir described the process to the Guide Istanbul. "Before shooting, we had to negotiate and convince 1,650 shop owners in the area of the Grand Bazaar, the Spice Bazaar, and in between. The crew also had to secure countless permits from Turkey's Ministry of Culture, Transportation Commission, and Istanbul's police department. Finally, the stunt was rehearsed several times to ensure it would go off without a hitch. Meet Boybe, the shop's owner, said repairs were costly, complicated, and resulted in lost revenue. He explained to Reuters, "This place is regulated by the Council of Monuments. We can't even change our window without their permission." He also revealed the response from Skyfall's production. "No one from the movie crew came to ask, 'What are your losses?' We filed a complaint at the police station." In a thrilling scene in Christopher Nolan's legendary 2008 movie The Dark Knight, the Joker and his gang divert and trap a SWAT escort in a tight underpass. They manage to destroy several vans and even a police helicopter. Batman enters the fray in his Batmobile, having just taken out a few parked cars himself. It's a chaotic, exciting sequence, captured with close kinetic camera movements. Unfortunately, according to Shortlist, those camera movements also resulted in the destruction of an IMAX camera. Breaking a camera during production happens. IMAX cameras are in another league though. The manufacturer typically just rents out their cameras. They're so expensive, most movie productions wouldn't be able to afford them otherwise. How expensive are they? A single IMAX camera costs $500,000 according to Premium Beat. That's right, $500,000 for one camera. $500,000 is nothing to sneeze at, but given how profitable the movie was, that's a cost easily written off. But there was another wrinkle. In 2008, IMAX cameras were very rare. We're talking count on one hand and have a finger left over rare. Yep, Nolan broke just one of 4 IMAX cameras in the world at the time. Christopher Nolan doesn't have just one destroyed IMAX camera to his name. During production on 2012's The Dark Knight Rises, another IMAX camera was destroyed. The movie centers around a conflict between Batman and Bane, a criminal mastermind who imposes martial law on Gotham City. This culminates in a massive fight on the steps of Gotham City Hall. Catwoman rides the Batpod motorcycle out of the building, down the steps, and directly into an IMAX camera. The motorcycle isn't moving particularly fast, but the stunt woman and the cameraman didn't realize they were on a collision course, and the IMAX camera was knocked right out of his hands. Another $500,000 down the drain. At least this time, the number of IMAX cameras in the world had finally climbed to double digits. Andrei Tarkovsky's 1986 film The Sacrifice takes the cake for accidental destruction. That film burned down a whole house. Twice. To be fair, burning down the house was intentional. Less intentional was the camera jamming. The crew was filming from a distance as flames ripped viciously through the house. People hustled about shouting orders before it became abundantly clear what happened. Tarkovsky was filmed covering his face with both hands and moaning. As the house burned uselessly, Tarkovsky said, "The last thing I expected was for the camera crew to screw up." The house was rebuilt, albeit at great expense, and the scene refilmed. The movie went on to be a classic, but it's unlikely anyone forgot the moment the awful truth of the first house's destruction was revealed. Joaquin Phoenix has never been afraid to go well beyond what's written in the script. Sometimes that results in an injury to himself, as in Joker, where the actor so embodied his role he dislocated his knee while filming a scene, as reported by comicbook.com. In The Master, Phoenix's character, Freddie Quell, is thrown into a jail cell adjacent to Philip Seymour Hoffman's Lancaster Dock, sending Quell into a rage. Hands cuffed behind his back, Phoenix thrashes wildly in his cell. He violently throws himself repeatedly into the top bunk bed, kicks at the door, and finally stomps the toilet. The first stomp dislodges it, but the second sends it into the ground where it shatters instantly. Director Paul Thomas Anderson told IndieWire, "That unfortunately was a real porcelain toilet, a historic toilet. We could only do it once." Phoenix told the New York Times he drew inspiration from wild animals in captivity that react so viscerally that they often end up hurting themselves. He said, "I didn't intend to break the thing. I didn't know that was possible." In an episode from the 3rd season of Battlestar Galactica, Edward James Olmos broke a model ship in an emotionally charged fit of improvisation. Unfortunately, they forgot to tell Olmos that the model ship wasn't a prop, but instead was an original borrowed from a museum. Olmos told the crowd at the 2012 Planet Comic-Con, "I said, what did you put it in the scene for? I mean, God almighty, I've just been told that my daughter's dead. What are you, nuts?" That original he reduced to kindling, it was reportedly worth a cool $200,000.
Movies are a big money industry with millions invested over months or even years of production. The slightest alteration can often have a ripple effect that causes a film's budget to quickly skyrocket. Here's a look at movies that lost tons of money from last-minute changes. Director Ridley Scott decided to completely wipe Kevin Spacey from his film All the Money in the World after the movie was already wrapped, following extensive accusations of sexual misconduct against Spacey. The cost was pre-estimated at around $10 million, which was a quarter of the film's original $40 million budget. Within 36 hours of making the call to pull Spacey, Christopher Plummer was announced as his replacement, and 200 new shots were filmed in only 9 days. Reshoot costs aside, there were additional marketing expenses, including the early push for Spacey's Oscar nomination that was canned. The film was pulled from the AFI Fest, which likely cost Sony 6 or 7 figures. Fortunately, Plummer more than picked up the slack, becoming the oldest actor to be nominated for an Oscar. The first Toy Story was a touching animated movie that helped make Pixar a filmmaking juggernaut. Disney and Pixar originally planned to release Toy Story 2 as a 60-minute direct-to-video release, much like the studio had done with sequels to Aladdin, Cinderella, The Lion King, Mulan, and even Hunchback of Notre Dame. Disney simply didn't do big-screen sequels yet. At a screening with Disney executives, they decided it was simply too good for the home video market. They opted to change gears and release it in theaters as a 90-minute feature. With such news, you'd think the production crew would be ecstatic. However, Pixar's John Lasseter wasn't quite so happy. He took over the project and rewrote the entire plot in 2 days. With an estimated budget of $90 million for the entire movie, one can assume that about half that amount was used in the 9-month-long fire drill that took place after the previous year-long production. Work on character creation and key environments was already done, but there were also several notable additions, including the character of Jessie, who was added in the rewrite. Decades ago, when the internet was in its infancy, a draft of the Scream 2 script was uploaded to the web during the film's production. This sent director Wes Craven, the production team, and Miramax into a panic. Fearing a spoiled ending would ruin the movie, they quickly decided to rewrite and reshoot a lot of the film. It set production back by months, with added measures to prevent the new script from being copied. 3 different endings were filmed to throw everyone off, and as a result, audiences got both a leaked and a surprise ending to this decent horror classic. Rewrites, reshoots, and an extra ending certainly contributed a significant chunk to its $24 million production budget. Superman and Superman 2 were filmed simultaneously to cut down on production time, but as costs mounted, Superman 2 was stopped so producers could focus on the first one. After Superman proved to be a success, production started again on the sequel. Well, sort of. There were a few difficulties, including Marlon Brando wanting more money and Richard Lester replacing the film's original director, Richard Donner. Lester quickly scrapped some footage and essentially started over, making the movie his own. With a final budget of around $54 million, most of that was certainly spent on reshoots. It created massive production expenses, but it resulted in 2 profitable films that critics actually enjoyed. Blade Runner is considered a sci-fi classic that's beloved by millions. Of course, nothing that great is easy to make. After a few test screenings failed to impress audiences, several last-minute changes were made, including the infamous Harrison Ford voiceover.
They don't advertise for killers in a newspaper. That was my profession.
The voiceover was so quick, Ford apparently never got to read it in advance. It was recorded 8 times, and he was fairly unhappy about doing it. There were also plot changes, and the ending was tweaked to make it less mysterious and more positive. At $28 million, the film was at least $7 million over budget. While adding a voiceover to an entire movie might not seem like a monumental cost, the total added expense left Blade Runner just shy of recouping its money in theaters. Fortunately for sci-fi fans and the many filmmakers who've since been influenced by the movie, cult status awaited on the home video market. 35 years after it faded from theaters, it got a sequel almost as widely acclaimed as the original. One of the saddest stories surrounding a last-minute movie change involves former Saturday Night Live star Chris Farley, who was the original voice of Shrek. At the time of his death, Farley had recorded 80 to 90% of his lines. Fellow SNL alum Mike Myers was quickly cast to replace him. At Myers' request, script changes were made to better accommodate his brand of humor. Myers realized that his initial take on the big green guy wasn't quite right, so he wanted to re-record his lines with a Scottish accent. At that point, more than a third of the movie had been animated, meaning mouth movements, facial expressions, and whatever else was in the scene would need to be redone. The cost was estimated at $4 million to $5 million, which was about 10% of the film's final budget, but it paid off in the end. Before Marvel started its own film studio, along with the massively successful Marvel Cinematic Universe, other studios attempted to turn the publisher's characters into blockbuster franchises. The results were often less than spectacular. Case in point, 2003's Daredevil, starring Ben Affleck as Matt Murdock, blind lawyer by day, secretly superpowered vigilante by night. It was never meant to be a big-budget superhero movie, but the success of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man gave the studio other ideas. What started as a dark look at the repercussions of violence was toned down for broader appeal. With the contractual obligation to make the movie PG-13, director Mark Steven Johnson had to re-edit Daredevil twice. Test audiences apparently wanted more romance between Daredevil and Elektra, so more quick cuts were made. And again, because of the success of the effects spectacle that was Spider-Man, the studio wanted more visual thrills. Nearly 30 minutes were chopped, including a subplot involving Coolio. All of the special effects and edits drove the budget from $50 million to $80 million. Regardless, it all worked out in the end, as Daredevil not only made enough money to spawn the Elektra spin-off, but it also led to something more for Affleck and Elektra actress Jennifer Garner, who were married in 2005. In Enemy Mine, Louis Gossett Jr. plays an alien named Drac, and Dennis Quaid is Earth pilot Willis Davidge. They're stranded together on a distant planet after a battle with, wait for it, each other. Naturally, they band together to weather the elements and defeat a common enemy. The studio was unhappy with early shots from director Richard Loncraine and decided to halt production after a large portion of shooting was completed. Execs still loved the concept, actors, and story, so director Wolfgang Peterson was brought in to finish the job, or really, restart the job and then finish it because the footage, sets, and makeup weren't up to snuff. After the studio mandated overhaul, Enemy Mine's original $17 million budget ballooned to over $40 million. It never recouped its costs, earning only $12 million, but it did eventually earn bragging rights as a cult classic. Guillermo del Toro's vision for Mimic, which involved humans possessed by a mutant tree beetle, ended up falling flat with studio execs. Instead, they envisioned giant killer cockroaches. Add that fundamental disagreement to the list of other things the studio didn't appreciate, and the result is what del Toro calls his imperfect child. The experience was so bad, he almost quit making movies altogether. A second unit was reportedly enlisted in case the studio decided to replace him. With an estimated budget of $30 million, it was generally panned by critics and only made $25 million back. Del Toro later got to return to make a director's cut, eliminating second unit shots and reinstating more atmosphere. He eventually went on to direct classics like Hellboy, Pan's Labyrinth, and The Shape of Water. With a production budget of $300 million, a slew of iconic superheroes in one movie, and a ton of talent on and off the screen, Justice League just had to succeed, right? Well, not exactly, and that hefty price tag didn't really help either. Part of the cost resulted from a director swap that became necessary after Zack Snyder stepped down to deal with the family tragedy. Writer-director Joss Whedon came in and reshot 15 to 20% of the movie, costing at least $25 million. Having to reshoot scenes is expensive enough, but bringing a cast back in from other projects can lead to even more problems, such as the Henry Cavill hairy upper lip debacle. The actor reprising his role as Superman had since grown a mustache for Mission Impossible Fallout. As a result, Warner Brothers was forced to digitally remove Cavill's mustache, adding to the already inflated budget. All that extra time and money didn't help Justice League with critics, and though the movie still made hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office, the fallout inspired Warner Brothers to re-examine its approach and retool its plan for the DC Extended Universe. You can call this one a mixed blessing.
Big budgets used to be exclusive to major Hollywood films, but that was before the current golden age of television started in the late 1990s. TV has never been this good or this pricey. Here are some of the most expensive scenes ever shot for the small screen. At $217 million, The Pacific was the most expensive miniseries ever made when it was released in 2010. Its depiction of the Peleliu beach landings in World War II alone cost $5 million, a figure that becomes even more staggering when you read The Hollywood Reporter's invoice breakdown. Some 300 actors worked on the 4-day shoot. The lead's daily rate was $700, stunt extras $150, and regular extras $70. This was economical according to the producers, who avoided big stars to offset the show's real money burners, which included uniforms, visual effects, and a whole arsenal of guns, explosives, and tanks. Then there was the CGI. Even simple effects such as adding a muzzle flash to a gunshot cost about $700. More complicated adjustments such as removing or masking features in the image ran about $40,000 per shot. 3.5 seconds of a landing craft, for example, cost almost $30,000. And these are just the post-production expenses. Each standard take during principal photography cost $13,500. The wide shots, of which there were 4 per day, could add up to $70,000. Spectacle costs money. That's why the pilot episode for Lost, which famously depicts a plane crash, cost ABC between $10 million and $14 million, the most expensive pilot in history at the time. The scene was constructed in multiple locations. It began aboard a mocked-up plane interior in a California soundstage, where director J.J. Abrams used a skillful blend of practical ingenuity and CGI to capture the horrifying panic as the aircraft drops out of the sky. The CGI takes over as we see the plane break apart and scatter across the ocean. Some additional disturbing moments were filmed on the coast of Oahu, Hawaii. It was here that the most expensive prop was used, a decommissioned airliner. The passenger plane was bought in the Mojave Desert and then transported to Hawaii, where it was staged in catastrophic fashion. Fortunately, ABC's investment would reap major dividends. Lost became one of the biggest shows of the 2000s, and occasionally one of its most confusing.
Alright dude, we're from the future.
Game of Thrones is a big show, a very big show. Everything about it is massive, including the budget. Metro reports that the notorious 8th season cost $90 million, which means $15 million for each of the season's 6 episodes. Of these, it's likely that the Battle of Winterfell cost the most. All of the pricey ingredients are here: a sweeping cast with established fame and hefty salaries, scores of extras decked in unique costumes, towering set design, and seamless integration of CGI. However, this huge battle split opinion among viewers. Many bemoaned how dimly lit the cinematography was, complaining that they had to adjust the brightness on their TVs because it was simply too dark to watch.
I can't see. That's your problem, not mine.
Other viewers loved it, with a headline at Games Radar quoting a claim that it was the most intense episode in television history. The $18 million pilot of Boardwalk Empire is effectively one big piece of world building that displays the show's glitz and glamour, including the lavish boardwalk set that cost $5 million.
That's a lot.
It's quite a lot.
The boardwalk set was staged in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and took months to build. In an interview with the Chicago Tribune, set designer Bob Shaw said that it was the biggest outdoor set built in New York City in almost 100 years. Then there were the small details. The storefronts were based closely on the Atlantic City Boardwalk circa 1920. That's just one part of the exhaustive research that went into the project, which covered everything from key moments of World War I and Prohibition to the wider popular culture of the era. Budgets tend to bulge when warfare and especially fire-breathing dragons are involved. The Crown has neither of those things, but 70 years of royal history doesn't come cheap. In fact, The Crown is one of the most expensive shows ever made, with the first season costing $130 million. The priciest scene in the 10-episode run is Queen Elizabeth II's wedding. It features a replica dress that, according to Harper's Bazaar, cost $37,000 to make. This standout piece of wardrobe was just one part of the show's ornate grandeur. In a conversation on the red carpet, actor Claire Foy said, "Every single penny was spent on screen. All the locations are appropriate but extraordinary. The costumes were handmade and designed. Also, we were shooting in London. It's so rare that you're able to shoot in London. We shut down the mall for an entire morning." Matt Smith, who played Prince Philip, added, "We had great costumes, great locations, so I think all the money went on screen." Sense8 was always going to be an expensive show because its 8 main characters are from every corner of the earth. According to Wired, this globe-trotting extravaganza was costing Netflix $9 million per episode when it was cancelled in June 2017. Of the show's 24 episodes, Season 2's Christmas special was likely the most expensive, in particular an underwater scene that took the cast and crew all the way to Malta. Filming underwater is far more complex than filming on dry land, and it often requires up to 3 times as many crew members. Then there are creative concerns, namely the complications affecting light and color, which means waiting for the opportune time period on the open sea or using elaborate lighting equipment if working in a tank. Either way, it's a matter of crew, time, and technology, all of which costs plenty of money. Jack Ryan is one of Amazon's proudest exhibits. It announced the company's intention to spend big money on big drama, $8 million per episode to be exact. Every action scene is an explosive testament to Amazon's deep pockets. Pinpointing a certain scene isn't easy because there are so many to choose from, but the subway shootout in Season 1, Episode 8 is definitely a highlight. As with so much of contemporary TV, the lines between reality and CG are blurred as Jack Ryan edges down the subway tunnel gun in hand. After a brief shootout, a train barrels along the tracks, obliterating one of the men Ryan's just shot. And it's exactly that type of CGI-driven moment that can take a big bite out of an episode's budget.
And it was totally worth it.
Most fans like to see their protagonists kick ass, especially when they're dealing with zombies. Depicting this is usually a rather modest affair, at least in the scheme of mega-budget TV. But which Walking Dead scene took the biggest chunk out of the show's budget? Well, Season 7's 9th episode saw prices go up when it featured 2 old cars, a line of wire, and a whole lot of walkers. The bulk of the cost was likely incurred during post-production. Processing all of those CGI flying limbs does not come cheap. Even the walkers' moans and groans were added by audio specialists. The undead extras are asked to remain silent. As usual, this scene was an amplification of a budget that was already full of expensive details. For example, Yahoo reports that AMC paid the families of Sonoya, Georgia, where the majority of the series is filmed, $400 a month to compensate for the hassle of production and to discourage locals from sharing any spoilers they might have seen. When Friends started in 1994, the budget was so tight that producers had to use a bottled episode format, which required the crew to use as few sets as possible and not even think of having special guests. Well, as everyone on the face of the earth knows, Friends would become one of the biggest shows in the history of American television, earning Warner Brothers a yearly syndication revenue of $1 billion. This success saw the modestly staged show end up costing a pretty penny for NBC. By the 8th season, each main cast member was earning $750,000 for every 30-minute episode. That's $25,000 a minute. So when Brad Pitt turned up for Thanksgiving dinner, it couldn't have been cheap. Still, it's a no-brainer when the choice is between money and an unforgettable episode.
What's more important, your friends or money?
Friends!
Just like with Lost back in 2004, showrunner J.J. Abrams wanted Fringe to make a strong first impression. Unfortunately for Fox executives, a sequence that included scores of extras, face-melting special effects, and a custom-built set would contribute to a $10 million budget. The cost breakdown would have shared much in common with Lost, a mocked-up plane interior, a soundstage, and detailed CGI. Only this time there was a strong serving of gory makeup applied to about a dozen extras aboard the doomed plane. Fringe, like other entries on this list, would see the budget fall after its pilot, plateauing at a rate of $4 million per episode. Yet another case of pilot extravagance. The costumes, period sets, and star power of Vinyl is said to have cost $30 million. However, despite the collaboration of Mick Jagger and Martin Scorsese, Vinyl landed with neither critics nor audiences. So why did it cost so much money? Well, much like 70s rock, too much is never enough.
That's what I'm talking about.
The pilot episode was effectively one big scene crammed with everything viewers could expect from the rest of the season. In the case of Vinyl, this manifested in a large ensemble cast, a sweeping wardrobe of authentic 70s garb, and a catalog of licensed music. The pilot's $30 million price tag was just 33% of the first season's $100 million budget, which would ultimately sink the show before it could take off. The Big Bang Theory had become a massive show by its 11th season. Its 250-plus episodes brimmed with the affectionate geekiness that fans around the world identified with. So for the season's final episode, which featured the marriage of Amy and Sheldon, the show needed an extra special guest. That guest, of course, was Mark Hamill, the iconic Star Wars actor.
That's Mark Hamill!
Hamill was the perfect choice to officiate the wedding of two super geeks, and he also brought some extra star power to the show. Although this wedding episode already boasted a bevy of high-profile cameos, including Kathy Bates, Jerry O'Connell, Laurie Metcalf, Will Wheaton, plus many more. And that's basically how a simple sitcom can cost $9 million for a single episode. Rome is another lavish production that was overwhelmed by its budget. In many ways, Rome set the stage for Game of Thrones, which would reach a far bigger audience using a similar brew of power, politics, and violence. The budgetary peak for Rome came with the depiction of the Battle of Philippi, which occurred in 42 BC during the Liberators' Civil War. It's a huge scene that mixes dozens of extras clad in full suits of armor and carrying a variety of weapons. Also, everything we see is supplemented by CGI that multiplies the scene's scope many times over. TV had never been staged like this before, a towering blend of sword and sandal grandeur mixed with modern grit and violence. Game of Thrones is a show that's too big to mention just once. Of all the chaos and majesty that we witness, the dragon attack in Season 7's 4th episode is perhaps the most awesome and the most expensive. The execution of this remarkable sequence was detailed in a short HBO documentary. When director of photography Rob McLaughlin learned about the scene, he had an understandable response.
Oh boy, that is going to be a lot of work.
McLaughlin's team operated at least 4 cameras, sometimes 7 or 8. They also used 3 different tracking vehicles to capture the huge Dothraki charges, which were also filmed on cameras hoisted on industrial cranes. Then there were the helicopter drones, which were supplied by a third party to add further dynamic shots to this complex sequence. The zenith of the episode occurs when the dragon focuses his deadly attack on the loot train, which we see from several perspectives. The practical effects team worked tirelessly to create a seamless line of explosions that would not only look authentic but also push an already epic depiction of a dragon in battle to the next level.
Making a big Hollywood blockbuster ain't cheap, but how expensive is too expensive? Which popular superhero just couldn't save the day, or rather, the opening weekend? Keep watching to find out. Sony has been trying to turn Ghostbusters into a franchise for 3 decades, with little success thanks in part to inflated expectations. The original Ghostbusters made $295 million worldwide in 1984, about $789 million worldwide in today's dollars. 5 years later, Ghostbusters 2 made $215 million worldwide, over $480 million worldwide today. So when Sony finally made a new Ghostbusters after the series spent nearly 30 years in development hell, they apparently figured the new version would land in that $500 to $800 million range. That may explain why they spent a bloated $144 million on 2016's Ghostbusters Answer the Call. The big problem is that it wasn't a sequel featuring characters we knew and loved, but a reboot with a whole new cast. That typically doesn't work out, and Answer the Call was no exception. The film finished with $229 million worldwide. Not bad for a comedy in modern Hollywood, but not nearly enough to warrant a sequel. Instead, Sony apparently learned their financial lessons and made 2021's Ghostbusters Afterlife for only half the budget of Answer the Call, allowing it to turn a profit.
You are a genius, Patty.
I'm a Ghostbuster.
Battleship is considered one of the biggest box office bombs of the past decade, and not even Rihanna's legion of fans would argue with that. But it's not for the reason you might think. Battleship wasn't a bomb because it didn't make money, it bombed because it didn't make enough money. Battleship scored $313 million worldwide in 2012, not bad for an insanely bad sci-fi film based on a board game. That was mostly due to its $248 million international gross. But it had the misfortune of debuting just after Marvel's The Avengers, which went on to become one of the highest-grossing films of all time. The crazy part? Battleship and The Avengers had almost the same budget. The Avengers cost $225 million, about only $5 million more than Battleship's $220 million. Yep, Universal almost spent the same amount on friggin' Battleship as Marvel did on The Avengers. According to The New Yorker, Battleship was greenlit with a $150 million budget, which would have allowed it to turn a profit. But after the production ran into issues, the studio had to throw tens of millions of dollars down the drain to try and fix it. Just because a character is a household name doesn't mean he's a box office draw. Thus, while Superman is probably the most famous superhero of all time, he's no longer the most bankable at the box office. Though he was once. In 1978, Superman the movie made moviegoers believe a man could fly and made a lot of money doing it, earning $300 million worldwide, about $1.2 billion today. Mighty impressive for the Man of Steel. After the original franchise ended with a whimper, with 1987's Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, Warner Bros. Spent almost 2 decades trying to figure out what to do next. The rest was 2006's Superman Returns, which at $232 million cost a lot more than other superhero origin stories at the time. 2002's Spider-Man, for instance, only cost $139 million to make, while 2005's Batman Begins cost $150 million. Superman Returns ended up earning $391 million worldwide. With Spider-Man or Batman Begins budgets, it would have made money, and likely would have spawned a whole new trilogy, just as those 2 films did. Thanks to its inflated budget, though, it has been considered a failure and signaled the final end of the classic Superman franchise. By 2012, the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise had earned about $3.5 billion across 4 films. Pride comes before the fall, so Disney, Johnny Depp, director Gore Verbinski, and producer Jerry Bruckheimer thought their relationship was a license to print gold and could do no wrong. But The Lone Ranger went wrong. Very, very wrong, beginning with the whole idea of reviving an outdated radio western that hadn't been popular for decades. In Disney's defense, they realized the film's budget was getting out of control and even shut down production to contain it. It didn't work. Sources vary, with the final budget estimated to have been between $225 million and $250 million. Wherever it landed, The Lone Ranger would have had to break records to break even. For context, The Lone Ranger cost about $100 million more than the first Pirates of the Caribbean film, despite starring Armie Hammer, who has since been accused of cannibalism, and worse. The film still made $260 million worldwide, so with a smaller budget, it could have been a success. But with those costs, making a Lone Ranger 2 would have been a true train wreck. Thanks to Star Wars, Marvel, Pixar, and Disney+, it may seem like the house that Walt built is indestructible. This conveniently ignores the fact that Disney's original live-action output has mostly been a wasteland of box office bombs, including some of the biggest disappointments of all time. In fact, Disney's desperation for live-action movies is probably why they purchased Marvel and Lucasfilms in the first place. One Disney film that did so-so and would have been a big hit if not for the even bigger budget was Tron Legacy. Tron bombed in 1982, and while it built a cult following, making a legacy sequel 28 years later to a movie nobody saw in theaters was a bit of a head-scratcher. Couple that with the $200 million price tag, and you'd have to wonder whether Mickey lost his marbles. Smartly, though, Disney positioned Tron Legacy as the must-see holiday blockbuster of 2010, and it mostly worked, as the film earned $399 million worldwide. Had Disney spent just a little bit less, there's no question we would have seen more sequels. As it is, though, the legacy of Tron is a failure. Speaking of waiting 3 decades to make an overpriced sequel of a movie that was a flop to begin with, say hello to 2017's Blade Runner 2049. The original Blade Runner made $39 million on a $28 million budget back in 1982, meaning it wasn't a disaster, but was far from a hit. Still, it has been hailed as a masterpiece by critics, so surely that would translate into ticket sales 35 years later, right? Warner Bros. Bet $185 million that it would. It didn't. With $258 million worldwide, the sequel far exceeded the original's take, but didn't come close to becoming a hit. We can argue all day whether Deckard was a replicant, but there's no debate on this. Blade Runner should not have been replicated at $185 million. What do you do when your movie's in production, isn't working, and you've already spent a ton of money on it? Option A is finishing the film and hoping for the best. Option B is dropping another several million in the hopes of fixing it. Warner Bros. Opted for Option B with Justice League, and the result was a mixed bag at the box office. After spending $275 million on 2017's Justice League, Warner Bros. Removed director Zack Snyder, replaced him with problematic Avengers director Joss Whedon, and dumped another $25 million into reshoots, bloating the budget to an incredible $300 million. They still hoped to turn a profit, as Batman vs. Superman had made $872 million worldwide, and Justice League was adding Wonder Woman, Flash, and Aquaman to the film. It should have been a surefire recipe for success. Instead, fans and critics alike hated the film. Bad word of mouth tanked it at the box office, and it limped to a $655 million worldwide gross. Though it made a small profit, it destroyed the franchise, and earned less than half of what Marvel's The Avengers had brought in 5 years earlier. All in all, Justice League was more train wreck than tentpole.
What was it like? coming back.
Itchy.
Conventional wisdom says the Mummy franchise was going strong until the Mummy Tomb of the Dragon Emperor bombed. As with most things, the conventional wisdom isn't wrong, it's just missing part of the story. Yes, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor was also really, really bad, even for a franchise that never got much love from critics. However, the Mummy franchise made money with every movie. The problem is that the budget on Tomb of the Dragon Emperor was so much bigger than its predecessors. 1999's The Mummy cost $80 million to make, while 2001's The Mummy Returns cost $98 million. But when Tomb of the Dragon Emperor came out in 2008, it cost a whopping $175 million. Tomb of the Dragon Emperor actually earned $405 million worldwide, almost the same amount as each of the previous films. But with a budget twice as high, it didn't make nearly as much money, killing the franchise deader than Imhotep. Harrison Ford is one of the 10 highest-grossing movie stars of all time, with career earnings $10 billion worldwide, and that's unadjusted for inflation. However, outside of Indiana Jones and The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and Star Wars The Force Awakens, Ford hasn't had an above-the-title hit since 2000's What Lies Beneath. That should have changed in 2020 with The Call of the Wild. Keyword, should. The Call of the Wild made $62 million domestically and $107 million worldwide. Fairly modest amounts, but for a film about a guy and his dog, it did quite well. One massive problem, though. 20th Century Fox spent an incredible $125 million to make it. Blame budgetitis, a term for Hollywood's inexplicable inability to make mid-budget movies. The big issue was their decision to use CGI to create Buck the dog, which turned what could have been a modest hit into a $50 million loser. Some box office observers argue that Robert Downey Jr. isn't a movie star outside his signature Tony Stark role. While there's no denying most of his $15.7 billion worldwide career earnings come from playing the man in the iron suit, he has proven to be a reliable draw in films like Tropic Thunder and the Sherlock Holmes movies. No, his butts in seats bankability isn't on par with Leonardo DiCaprio or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, but no other movie stars have that drawing power either. It seemed like Downey Jr. would add to his bankable resume with 2020's Dolittle, but instead that movie turned out to be a Titanic turkey, and not a talking one either. Yet Dolittle actually made $251 million worldwide, about on par with other live-action kids' movies released in the past 15 years, as the subgenre has been dominated for more than a decade by animation. The problem? Somebody at Universal thought it was a good idea to spend $175 million on Dolittle, which is actually more than Iron Man 2 cost to make. Expecting Downey Jr. to pull MCU numbers in a non-Iron Man role was dumb. Still, he might have been one of the only humans popular enough to save Dolittle from utter destruction.
It's not good, as far as I'm concerned. I'm the only human here.
Comedies hit or miss at the box office, as humor doesn't always translate overseas. What's a movie studio to do? You don't spend millions on pricey VFX like you're making a Marvel movie. Instead, you spend most of its money on the movie star and hope he can put butts in the seats. Unless you're Universal, that is. Bruce Almighty, with Jim Carrey's mug plastered on the poster, made $484 million on an $81 million budget in 2003, making it not only Carrey's biggest hit, but one of the highest-grossing comedies ever. But Bruce Almighty worked because of the Jim Carrey as God concept, not the brand. There was no indication audiences would show up to Steve Carell as Noah just because Universal slapped Almighty on it. Welp, Universal felt otherwise, and spent $175 million on the film, more than twice Bruce's budget, making it the most expensive comedy ever made to that point. The budget was supposed to be just $140 million, but costs ran up thanks to CGI and live animals. Ultimately, the film made $174 million worldwide, which wasn't bad for a comedy sequel that didn't even star the original actor, but was a disaster of biblical proportions based on the budget.